In 2006, there was a tragedy that happened in what's called the West Nickel Mine School. It was an Amish school. It was October 2nd. A man walked in and just started shooting school children. His name was Charles Roberts. Eventually, 5 young ladies died. Many more were injured. He killed himself in the process. And I remember when this happened, a few of the emotive responses that I had. The first, at least for me, was anger. Anger at the individual. Anger at a society that has glamorized violence. Anger at God for seemingly allowing such a tragic event to happen. I had kind of flashbacks to what was my age group's sort of crisis moment in America, which was April 20th when Columbine happened. Half you guys were either babies or not alive, which is really weird. I remember sitting on my bed in my house watching the newsreels as it showed students being carried out and children running away and crying, and people just trying to figure out what could cause this, and probably very similar to the response at least some of us felt a few Sundays ago when the church in Texas was invaded and shot. And the question, the pragmatic question that comes up are twofold. One is, what do we do with the idea of evil and violence in the world? How do we as Christians reconcile an all-loving, all-powerful God with the fact that extremely tragic situations happen? And then the other response, and maybe the more pragmatic one, is what is our proper response as Christians? What do we do in the face of overwhelming evil? What do we do in the face of overwhelming violence? What do we do in the face of a world that is seemingly increasingly having an appetite for bloodlust? What is our proper response? And then even more so, what is our response when it happens to us? What do we do? I think our natural human response, again, at least mine was to rail at God. I remember in the aftermath of Columbine, my faith sort of slowly being eroded. How could you let this happen? How could you allow for this? There was always the story of the young lady. They asked her if she was a Christian. She said yes. He ends up shooting her. There's some questions whether he was talking to her or not, but the fact still remains that they had zero issues killing individuals that seemingly were Christians. And I remember thinking as I went into high school later that year, and as we had a gun threat at our high school from a copycat, if I would have been that person, would you have spared me? And if you didn't, why not? And I started throwing this responsibility back at God. And I'm going to be honest with you today. I don't know as Christians if our normal responses are appropriate. I'm amazed how often we immediately go on the defensive. We want to argue for the sake of God, which is understandable in some cases. But what I find is that God's response to evil is not a proposition. It's a person. When we're asked what God's response to violence and God's response to evil is, we as Christians point to the cross. We see a suffering Savior, a God whose response to the overwhelming violence in the world was to come down and die. Right? What a horrible game plan. Like in our world, right? I mean, can you imagine like being in a strategic meeting with a general? You're at war, and they say, "Hey, we're going to win this war." How are we going to do that? Well, we're going to go out and die. I vote for a new general, right? That's my immediate response. If I'm a soldier, I'm going, this guy is off his rocker. God's response to evil wasn't to meet it back with force, but to overwhelm it with love. God's response to the evil and violence in the world was not to come down and wipe out the perpetrators, but was to come down and die for them. It turns everything that we know on its head. When Jesus shows up, he starts saying things we don't understand. I sometimes feel bad for the disciples because the disciples are kind of like the PR team for Jesus. And when Jesus would say something stupid in their minds, I feel like they had to go out and try to fix it. Jesus says, hey, there's huge crowds coming, and he says, guys, if you really want to live forever, you have to eat of me. And they're like, I'm sorry, what? You've got to eat me. Oh, and drink my blood. Okay, Jesus, this has got to stop. I just see Peter out there being like, he doesn't mean that, right? Like that was my mom. That was my mom for me when I would have arguments with girls. She was pretty sure that I was never going to get married, right? And so, which, it took a while. And so she would be like, I would say something, and she would be like, oh, he doesn't mean, that's not what he means. And she would try to fix my sayings. I'd be like, no, that's exactly what I mean. He's like, he's tired. He does, and my mom was just begging them not to break up with me, right? Like that's what I visualize the disciple. Man, Jesus comes in and he says things like, you want to be first, get in the back of the line. You want to live, you got to die. And it's not after death that we find life. It is in the act of dying that we find life. And he just keeps saying this. You want to follow me? Compared to your love for me, you have to hate your mother and your father and your brothers and your sisters, which for some of you, you're like, I'm in, right? Like, no problem. Have you met my little brother? Others of you, my wife, her family is the most important thing in the world to her. And when she reads passages like that, she does a holy page turn, right? Where she's like, I don't want to deal with that one right now. And she just goes on, and there's got to be something edifying in there, right? He turns everything we know on its head. He takes all of the conventional wisdom of the world and says, that's not the way this was supposed to work. And so when most of us, myself included, want to respond in force, want to respond in anger, want to respond with violence, God responded in love. In self-sacrificing, self-giving love. And those of us who have experienced that grace and that mercy and that love and that forgiveness are supposed to be acting out of our thankfulness. This is a season of thankfulness. Some of you guys are doing the thankful every day for something. We have to do that in November, and then we can go back to being greedy and selfish the rest of the year. Hey, I think it's funny, November, at least as a kid, November was all like, I'm so happy with everything that I have, and I'm just great. And then literally the moment December hit, it was like, why don't I have all the toys that I need right now? Like, where is my Nintendo Switch, right? And so, right, it's little, it's almost as if the calendar is making fun of us, right? Like, be thankful and then hate everything you have and need new things. Like, it's literally within a month. Right, this is a season of thankfulness. And so as we as Christians, when we respond, we're supposed to respond to things out of our thankfulness for the blessings that God has given us. Peter talks about this. In 1 Peter, let's see if I find it. Here we go. 1 Peter 3, we're going to just read 8 and 9. It's the only two I'm going to read. But this is what it says. Finally, all of you be harmonious, sympathetic, affectionate, compassionate, and humble. That's how Peter describes how we're supposed to deal with one another. If you're a Christian today, the way you're supposed to be engaging with other Christians is being of one mind, harmonious, sympathetic, affectionate, compassionate, and humble. That's where he starts. And this is supposed to be the easy part because this is with other Christians. Like, when's the last time you've heard somebody that's not a Christian out in the world be like, those Christians, they drive me nuts. They're so harmonious and sympathetic. They're just too affectionate and compassionate with one another. And gosh darn it, if they don't stop that humility, I'm just going to be livid. Is this describing the way we encounter one another? No, of course not. And I think part of the reason is, one, I think it's a failure to be thankful for that which we have gotten. I think we've become at times so accustomed to the grace of God that we forget the awesome scandal that it has presented. I think when you grow up in a situation where God is just sort of there, I don't know how many of this is for you, but I think many of us grew up in a church situation where we were just sort of there. We heard about it a lot. We sang about it a lot. We come here, we hear about it a lot. We sing about it a lot. We talk about it a lot. We teach about it a lot. And we've become so accustomed to the idea of God that he just sort of becomes a second thought in our mind. One of the dangers of being a priest in the Old Testament was that you handled holy things so often they became common. And I think the danger of being a Bible college student or a student at a Christian liberal arts school is we engage with the holy so often we forget how holy it actually is. And we come to chapel and we sing and we raise our hands and dudes break drumsticks and Terrell always makes my lights because he pounds the thing so hard. I've got, if you guys notice that only happens one day a week, you're killing me, Terrell. Right? And so I'm like duct taping those things together now. Like, that's what I've done. I went back and try to get it now. Please don't actually try it. So, right? I mean, man, you go to class and your professors are talking about God. You go back to your dorm room. There's always that one annoying guy in the lobby with the guitar singing about God, right? And there's, if it's warm, he's out under the tree hoping girls see him, right? There's always, if that's you, I'm sorry. I'm not naming anyone in particular, just the idea, right? God is everywhere in our lives, and he is everywhere. But the problem is we get so tied up with the fact that he's everywhere that if God is everywhere in our mind, sometimes he's not anywhere. If God is everywhere, then where do you go to find him? What does that look? If nothing is sacred and everything is sacred, then really there's nowhere to meet God. There's nowhere to expand. And so what happens is we live disenchanted lives. We live lives that have lost the magic of the grace of God. And it's hard to be thankful for something you're not really thinking about. Like, I'll be honest. When I drive and I hit my brakes and I stop, very rarely do I think, oh, I'm so thankful for brakes. Like, how many do you do that? Like, you stop at a red light, you're like, oh, look at that, it worked again. Call up sheriff, baby, my car stopped again. That's 257,000 times in a row. These things are awesome. I wasn't thankful for brakes until one day on the highway, I hit the brakes and my car just started shaking and not stopping. And then I called my wife and said, baby, I'm going to die. Tell Harper I love her. And what I found out later is my actual disc brake had cracked. And when I finally took it in the shop, which was like 3 weeks after that event because I'm an idiot, right? I was just trusting that God was going to do something in my life. Fix the brakes, God. Just touch them. Just let the blessings fall. Do you do that? I do that with my gas too when it hits empty. Like, look, give me in faith, I'm claiming another 15 miles, God. 20 if I'm in a traffic jam, right? And though, after those things got fixed, the next time I drove my car and I was on the same road, it was 23 out here when you're heading, and I hit the brakes and I started to stop. I just went, oh, they work. And in my mind, I was like, I think that's the first time I've ever been thankful for brakes. I didn't realize it until I needed it. And I wonder if in our modern day Christianity and church, it's only when these crises happen that we recognize our need for grace. And if you only recognize your need and crisis, you're probably not experiencing it. If I had a cup here of tea, and when I say tea, I mean sweet tea. There is tea and unsweetened tea, all right? There is no sweet tea. Tea is just supposed to be sweet, all right? Let's just put that out there right now. When I go to places and they have unsweetened tea, or they have sweet tea, I'm like, what you mean is tea, idiots, all right? And so So I have tea in my cup, and let's say my friend John up here, because he's a bully, walks up and shakes my hand like that. And I ask you the question, why is tea flying every place? Often our response, ladies, think about it, is because the bully John shook your hand, right? But that's not why tea flew out. That's why something flew out of the cup, but that's not why tea flew out of the cup. Tea flew out of the cup because that's what was in the cup. Crisis doesn't create character, it reveals it. I was waiting for that. I thought you'd enjoy that one. I'm going to stomp next time too. Right? Crisis doesn't create character, it reveals it. And so when these sort of experiences happen, our responses show where we really are as Christians. And the way that starts is how we engage with one another. And if we're not thankful for the grace of God that has utterly transformed us and forgiven us while we were still sinners, while we were enemies of God, He threw up a surrender flag and gave us victory. And if we're not thankful for that, we're never going to engage with one another the way we're supposed to. And if we can't engage with one another the way they're supposed to, how on earth are we going to move to the next verse, which talks about the way we're supposed to deal with the world? And this is how he says we're supposed to deal with the world. Do not return evil for evil or insult for insult, but instead bless those who persecute. Because you were called to inherit a blessing. He says you have been blessed to bless your enemies. The proper response as Christians is the same response that God showed us. We're supposed to love our enemies. He meant that, right? That wasn't just like a cliche phrase he came up with. We're supposed to pray and bless those that persecute us. When's the last time you've done that in your life? But just think about it for a second. When's the last time in your life you've thought, man, Lord, I am so thankful for that jerk in my theology class. Like, just bless him. We don't mean it. I heard a story. This is a crazy story. This guy in England, he got called by a coven of witches, like actual pagan witches, which is on my bucket list, right? Someday I want to make people so angry that witches are calling me, right? And so this guy had been doing this work in this area, and apparently a few of the people had converted from their coven, and they were angry with him, right? So this witch calls him, and he picks up the phone, and she just starts blasting him with curses. Not like when we think curses, like actual curses. Like she's doing magic over the phone, cursing this dude, right? And I'm like, oh, why not me? Like, this is my dream, right? And so I read too many fantasy books. Like I'm right? Expecto Patronum you know, right? And so, right? So like she's literally cursing him on the phone. And she's just like, and finally he's had enough. And he's like, stop. You stop it right now. And she stops. And she's ready for him to come. And this is what he says to her. This is the pastor. This is what he says to her. He says, listen, I not only accept those curses, but here's what I'm going to pray. I'm going to pray that every curse that you just cursed me, that God would bless you twofold. That whatever you sinned at me bad, that God would make it show up in your life good 2 times whatever it is you're giving me. And she got mad and hung up, right? Like, he's like, no, wait, I've got more things. She's living with him. But it seems to be the proper response. If we're going to call ourselves Christians, if we're going to call ourselves Christ followers, if we're going to say that we're actually thankful for this grace, mercy, and love, and peace and forgiveness of God that we have experienced, then we have to engage with the world differently. Let's go back to that story. The Amish families. That night, a group of the parents and grandparents of the girls that died went and found the killer's family and held them while they wept. They went to his wife, they went to his daughter, and they said, we know that you're experiencing as much, if not more, pain. And we want to show you love. At that man's funeral, 35 Amish men came and sat down right behind the widow. Not as a protest, as an act of love. There were men sitting in that row that had lost a daughter because of the actions of the man in the coffin. And one of the grandfathers stood up when the press came and said this: "We have to be careful not to hate this man." He's done his deed, and he's now standing before a just God. Hate fixes nothing. The killer's wife was one of 3 outsiders that was invited to the funeral of the 5 girls. That's radical. When we talk about living countercultural here around the world, I'm amazed sometimes with the arrogance in which we purvey it. Sometimes we're just proud of the fact that we get to live differently than the world. And really, a lot of times what we mean by that is they have a certain sexual ethic, or they have a certain modesty ethic, or they have a certain whatever, and we're better than that. And we pride ourselves when we take these stands on truth. I'm not going to be quieted. I'm going to stand up for God, because that's what we're supposed to do. And maybe we are. But when I still see real, authentic, radical Christianity, I look at a group of Amish people who loved despite loss, who prayed in the midst of persecution, who were thankful for the grace and the mercy that God had given them, and showed that same grace and mercy to others. One of the reporters asked one of the fathers, "How can you forgive such a horrendously evil act?" And this was his response: "Oh, that act is unforgivable. But we must forgive the person." When I say I forgive you, I'm not saying that what you did is okay. When I say that I forgive you, I'm not saying that your actions are somehow dignified or appropriate. What I'm saying is, I'm separating you from your actions, just as Jesus separated me from mine. And that when you insult me, and when you persecute me, and even, God forbid, if they come at us violently, the acts are unforgivable. But we must forgive the person. What I found is often unforgiveness is like drinking poison and hoping your enemy dies. It's a bitter pill that we swallow that does nothing. And when we don't forgive, we allow people who care about us the least to affect us the most. When we don't forgive, we allow this seed of bitterness to sprout inside of us. And what I will promise is, it is never content until it has all of you. Might start with something small, might be something huge. But the Christian's response is always the same as Christ's. Father, forgive them. And I would add, and help me to do the same. Lord, we're thankful that you're here today. Lord, in this season of thankfulness, may we never forget who you are. May we never forget the grace and the love and the mercy that you have showed us. May we never forget the thankfulness, the forgiveness that we live in every day. May we not be here at a place where we encounter you so often that it just sort of becomes common. May we always be in awe and wonder of the awesome, scandalous grace that you have poured out on us. And may we be transformed to the point that we can do the same. May our response in the face of insults, may our response in the face of persecution, may our response, yes, even in the face of violence, be that of Christ. May we love. May we forgive. Because you have loved and forgiven us. In Christ's name I pray. Amen. God bless you and keep you. May his face shine upon you. Go in peace, everyone.